The great halls of the palace were filled with bright light that spilled through tall windows. The floors shone like mirrors, polished each morning to reflect the banners of red and gold that swayed gently above. Every sound carried across the open space, from the footsteps of guards in heavy boots to the whispers of court advisors lingering near the doors. It was not an ordinary day. It was a day set aside for a meeting between the royal family and a small group of soldiers who had recently returned from distant service. Among the gathering was Princess Alira, daughter of the Queen, who moved through the hall with grace but also with a weight she tried hard to hide. The eyes of the court followed her every step. She was known for her calm appearance, her measured voice, and her ability to hold perfectly still under pressure. Yet behind her poised expression, her heart beat faster than she wished. She would never tell anyone, but this one meeting caused her more unease than all the ceremonies before. She kept adjusting her hands, folding them together, and then releasing them, as if the action could steady her nerves. The hall felt warm, though the draft of early morning still passed through the stone corridors. She reminded herself that tradition demanded she stand confident before those who had served the realm. She reminded herself that it was her task not to falter in public, not even for a heartbeat. The soldiers entered soon after. Their uniforms looked worn, their boots dusty. They were men who had come from the edge of dangerous work, and their posture carried discipline that could not be faked. They were lined in order, shoulders straight, each pair of eyes forward. The Queen, from her seat at the end of the hall, gave them her gaze, sharp but welcoming. Alira stood slightly to the side, watching closely as names were called and introductions made. Among them stood one man, younger than most in the line, though the weight of service was in his stance. His name was Daniel Carter. His uniform was simple and plain compared to the ornaments of the hall, yet something about him drew Alira's attention more than the others. His face held no smile, yet also no sign of fear. His eyes were direct, steady, as if he saw the world not as a puzzle of ranks and crowns, but as challenges to be understood. When his turn came, he stepped forward, saluted, and gave his name aloud. The sound was firm but not loud, a soldier's voice shaped by discipline but softened by civility. He did not bow deeply as many at court would when addressing royalty, showed respect, clear and certain. But it was the respect of equals in duty rather than the flattery usually offered in a royal hall. For Alira used to finely practiced gestures and polished compliments. The lack of ornament unsettled her. She met his eyes for only a second longer than expected, and she quickly forced herself to look forward, praying no one had noticed. Composure, she reminded herself. Composure must remain. Yet when her glance had met his, she felt her calm mask tremble. It was as if he carried with him the grit of a world beyond the palace walls, a raw honesty that cracked through the glass shield she carried every day. The Queen spoke at length to the soldiers, thanking them for their service and offering words of blessing. Alira stood beside her mother, nodding when expected, silent when expected, her role well practiced. Yet with each word, she found part of her attention drawn back to Daniel Carter, who stood among his group with steady shoulders and focused eyes. When the formal greetings ended, the soldiers were allowed to lower their postures, and the Queen encouraged light words of exchange. Courtiers moved quickly to speak with the most decorated captains and officers. Alira's task was only to observe, or at least that was what she told herself as her gaze shifted once again toward the young soldier. Why did his presence disturb her so much? She had met ambassadors, kings, rival princes, and envoys polished in layers of experience, yet none had unsettled her in this way. Perhaps it was because he showed no need to hide who he was. He was not shaped by diplomacy, not encased in careful words. He stood as a man who had lived simply and faced danger directly. He did not seem to try winning hearts, yet he did not close his own. Alira felt the tension in her chest grow heavier. She lifted her chin a little higher to hold her calm. She moved gracefully, giving small smiles and short words to those near her as expected. Still, deep inside, she was aware that for the first time in her life, her practiced control was slipping in the presence of someone who never even tried to unsettle her. The hall remained bright, filled with many voices, yet for her the space had narrowed. Circling around one simple soldier who stood silent among his peers, unaware of the battle of composure he had already stirred within the princess. Daniel Carter had not expected his morning to turn into a moment of great importance. When he first received the orders to attend the palace, he thought he would only stand in silence, one more uniform in a line of many. He did not know he would find himself under the sharp eyes of the queen and the steady gaze of the princess beside her. He tried to seem calm, though the weight of the palace pressed against him far more heavily than any duty station. The marble pillars stretched to impossible heights. The banners fell down like rivers of color, and the nobles moved with practiced grace. They belonged to a world Daniel had never been part of and never thought he would enter. All around him were signs of tradition that stretched back far beyond his memory. Yet he stood there in boots that still bore dust from training fields, carrying no weapon, only the straightforward presence of a soldier. He felt the eyes of the court, but most of all, he noticed hers. The princess looked delicate, her dress shining in soft gold that shimmered when the light touched it. Her steps were careful, smooth like water, but her eyes made him pause. He had been trained to look ahead, trained to keep his thoughts plain and his words measured, yet he caught the faintest tremor in her stare. For reasons he could not explain, Daniel thought she looked as if she carried 1,000 burdens inside her, even while her face remained calm. When the queen ended her speech, small groups began to form. Advisors pulled soldiers aside, asking questions of duty and service, trading polite words for the sake of appearance. Daniel lingered at the edge, aware he was not the center of interest. His rank was small, his deeds not nearly as decorated as those of the officers. He preferred it this way. He had never cared for praise. He did his work because work had to be done. Still, he could not ignore that the princess's gaze drifted more times than it should toward him. Lyra tried to control her thoughts as she moved through the hall. She told herself firmly that it was her duty not to show interest in anyone beyond what was proper. Nothing should disturb the balance of her role. Yet something about the young soldier unsettled that balance, a small crack in her calm. His words, short and honest, lingered in her mind. When he had spoken his name, it had sounded neither heavy nor timid, only real. It was rare to hear sincerity in a setting where people clothed their sentences in layers of caution. The hours stretched slowly. The officers spoke of tactics. The advisors went on about politics. The queen listened with quiet wisdom, choosing her responses with care. Through it all, Alira battled her thoughts. Why did she continue to look toward him? Why did her heartbeat quicken whenever his face came into focus? Across the hall, Daniel found himself asking similar questions. Why did his eyes lift, against all training, toward the figure of the princess? Why did he notice small things like the way her hand rested calmly against the side of her gown, or the way she nodded at each sentence as if carrying the meaning deeper than anyone else could see? He reminded himself firmly that he was a soldier. His task was service, not curiosity. The palace was far beyond his reach, far beyond his station, and yet some unspoken pull was already at work. One of the advisors approached Daniel, asking about his patrol service. He spoke plainly of it, not trying to enlarge his role, not cutting away mistakes. He admitted when missions had failed, when danger had been close, when fear had been sharp but overcome. His truthfulness caught the ear of those nearby, but it caught the heart of the princess more deeply. She stood within hearing range, silently, pretending to look at the banners. She listened as he spoke with no effort to present himself as greater than he was. The palace was a place of masks. For Alira, it had always been about standing tall behind the careful cover of composure. Yet now, here was a man who seemed to wear no mask at all, standing in dusty boots before banners woven from gold. That contrast made her chest tremble in ways she had not felt before. She raised her chin again, willing her body into stillness. What if someone noticed her shift of attention? What if they saw the flicker in her eyes? Daniel sensed none of her inner battle. He thought only of answering questions and returning to his position in line. But when he raised his eyes for a brief moment, hers met his once more. And in that instant, both of them felt the hall grow quieter. Around them, words continued. Nobles moved, advisors talked. The queen sat upon her chair, but there in that silent second, something different happened. It was not duty, not rule, not formality. It was a recognition. Neither spoke, neither broke the rules that surrounded them. But the air between the soldier and the princess had begun to change. And though Alira willed herself to stand collected, her thoughts admitted the truth she feared most. For all her practice, for all her composure, She was no longer the same as she had been before their eyes met. The sun had slipped lower in the sky as the meetings in the palace carried on. Hours of speeches and careful exchanges filled the hall. One side of the grand chamber smelled faintly of wax and old paper from the ledgers and lists spread out on polished tables. Beyond the tall windows, the sky glowed with warm orange light, but inside all felt heavy, slow, and burdened. Daniel remained in place, following his orders quietly. His posture was steady, his voice plain whenever a question reached him. Yet he remained apart from the bustling groups of high advisors. He often felt worlds away from the life before him in that hall. His days as a soldier had been full of dust, cold nights, and fast decisions. Palaces moved differently, weighed down with ceremony and fine words that sometimes seemed to avoid saying anything at all. Illyra stood near the queen, nodding in agreement whenever her mother's voice addressed the gathering. To all in the hall she looked as calm as ever, her body still, her expression practiced and smooth. Yet on the inside her thoughts stormed together in restless waves. She tried to keep her face shaped into calm lines, but her mind circled again and again toward the soldier who stood in the line of men not far from her. She thought about his plain answers, his honesty. He did not try to impress anyone, yet he pressed into her thoughts far more sharply than the officers who wore ribbons and jewels. She told herself to stop staring, to focus on her duty, but it was more difficult with each passing moment. Each time her eyes wandered, she found him again, standing steady, his back straight, his gaze forward. Then, in the middle of another speech from a minister, one of the doors to the hall opened in a rush. A courier hurried in, breathless and unsettled. His voice carried across the chamber as he announced news from the border. It was not good news. Whispering spread like quickfire among the nobles as the queen listened with tense attention. Disorder had risen, and trouble threatened to spill farther into the realm. The officers and advisors began to argue rapidly. Plans were thrown out like sparks, words clashed against each other, and the neat order of the event broke. Maps were rushed onto tables, voices grew louder, and the fragrance of perfume in the hall was swiftly replaced by the sharp taste of fear. The queen kept her composure, but even her voice was pressed by the need for quick answers. Daniel felt his heart tighten. He was used to this feeling, the shift from calm to alarm, when danger moved from rumor to reality. In the field there was no time for heavy speeches. There were only quick steps, realistic choices, and the focus on keeping men alive. Without thinking, his body shifted closer to the table where the officers gathered. He said nothing at first. He listened, his hands folded behind his back, his mind clear. Illyra watched him closely. Out of all the noblemen, it was Daniel who seemed least shaken, though his rank was the smallest. The princes of distant houses argued over honor, the ministers argued over resources, and the generals debated pride. Daniel did not raise his voice. At last, when there was a pause, he spoke. His tone was calm, direct, and simple. He pointed out the dangers as they truly stood, without flourishes. He spoke from experience, not from documents. He named the problems as he had seen them, and gave honest suggestions about safer movements of men and supplies. At first, no one wished to listen. An older general frowned at him and turned sharply away, but another younger commander asked him to explain further. Slowly, Daniel described a clear route that would reduce risk and protect the villages closest to the trouble. His hands moved across the map, marking paths with his finger. His words were without pride or weakness, only steady and real. Illyra felt her throat tighten as she listened. She heard more truth in his simple words than in all the grand claims from the others. She saw his focus, his calm strength, the way he spoke not for his own gain but for the safety of people who had no voice in the palace. For the first time she understood that he carried a kind of authority that did not need jewels or crowns. The queen noticed him as well, her sharp eyes narrowing in interest. The old general scoffed, but the queen raised her hand in silence, asking Daniel to speak again. He did, repeating each point with patience. By the end, several of the rulers and commanders were nodding. Through all of this, Illyra felt her mask slipping. Her hands shook slightly against her gown, hidden from view, but her mind refused to stay quiet. She could not stop her thoughts from circling around the soldier who had suddenly placed himself in the middle of a decision that might shape the safety of the realm. He was only one man in the line, but in that moment, he held more weight than any noble in the chamber. The meeting stretched into the night as maps and orders were reshaped. And as it all unfolded, Illyra realized something new. She no longer feared only the loss of her composure. She feared what would happen if she one day had to stand without the presence of this soldier, whose plain words had already steadied an entire hall. The palace grew quieter after the burst of arguments and planning. The great maps had been rolled up and carried away, the generals dismissed to prepare their commands. The queen left the chamber with a calm face, though all knew her thoughts were shaped by the heavy news. Only a few remained in the wide hall, and among them were Princess Illyra and the soldier Daniel Carter. He stood back at his place, eyes steady again, arms resting behind him, as if nothing remarkable had passed. Yet everyone who had heard his words now looked at him differently, with interest or suspicion. Some disliked that he had spoken so boldly. Others admired the simplicity of his clear thinking. Illyra could not stop her mind from turning over his voice and the strength she had seen. Later that evening, when the chamber had emptied, Illyra walked through the long corridor lit by soft lanterns. Her steps echoed faintly, and her gown brushed against the polished stone floor. She tried to steady her breathing, but her thoughts refused to grow quiet. Against all training, she longed to speak with Daniel again. She told herself it was only curiosity, perhaps duty to understand the minds of her mother's soldiers, yet in her heart she knew it was more personal. She found him in the outer court, where the soldiers rested between orders. Some sat in groups, eating bread, sharing quiet laughter, or rubbing polish into their boots. Daniel sat alone on a bench beneath a tall lamp, his back straight even while off duty. His hands were folded, and his gaze was fixed on the dark courtyard beyond. When she approached, he rose quickly to stand in respect. He opened his mouth to speak, but then paused, his words caught in respect for her place. She felt her throat tighten, as if the simple act of beginning a conversation might undo all of her training. For a moment they stood in silence, the cool air moving softly between them. At last she said only that she had come to thank him for his service. Her voice was steady, though inside she shook. Daniel replied that he had done nothing more than his duty, the same as any man in his unit. He spoke in simple words, without politeness, shaped to please. It was the same voice she had heard earlier in the hall, and it struck her again how real and direct he seemed. They stayed a few minutes longer, their words slowly opening. Illyra asked him why he had chosen that path of service, and he answered in plain truth. He said he had joined not for glory or honor, but because someone must stand on the line to keep others safe. He said he hoped for no reward, only the knowledge he had done what was needed. His answer touched her in a way she could not explain. In that quiet courtyard beneath a lantern light, the princess, who had been trained to speak in rehearsed tones, found herself wanting to listen. Simply to listen to the soldier who was unafraid to reveal plain truth. Daniel, though, carried his own battle. He told himself again and again to keep his words measured, to remember his place. She was the daughter of the queen, placed high above where a man like him could ever dream to reach, yet he could not turn away from her eyes. He noticed the careful way her hands folded in front of her, the small tilt of her head when she listened. She was not cold, or distant as he had expected royalty to be. She was human, and that unsettled him more than the dangers of battle ever had. The night deepened, and soon Illyra had to part. She gave him a small nod, a sign of respect. Though her chest burned with emotions, she did not dare name aloud. He bowed slightly in his way and watched her walk back into the tall shadows of the palace. When she returned to her rooms, she sat at her window, watching the stars above the gardens. For the first time in years, she felt her mask weaken, and she did not resist it. In the silence of her room, she asked herself what it meant that she, daughter of the queen, could not remove from her. Thoughts the image of a soldier who had walked into her life without effort but left her changed. And in the courtyard below, Daniel remained on the bench long after the other soldiers had gone to rest. He looked toward the dark windows high above, knowing she was there. Told himself this was nothing more than passing chance, that soon he would be away on duty again. Yet inside, he understood he had crossed a line as well, into feelings that would not be silenced simply by the call of discipline. The next morning arrived with a pale light spreading slowly across the city. The palace was already awake, servants busy in the halls, guards stationed at every door, advisors rushing with papers and reports, Rumors filled the air. The trouble at the border had grown worse in the night, and decisions had to be made quickly. Princess Illyra prepared herself to face another long day of duty. Her chambermaids dressed her in fine robes, and she stood as still as stone while they worked. On the outside she looked calm, as a princess must, but on the inside she felt the same storm as the day before. The memory of her late meeting with Daniel filled her thoughts, and for once, she wished the world would leave her to those memories alone. But duty did not wait for anyone. By the time she reached the council chamber, the room was alive with voices. Maps covered the table once again, and generals argued over strategies. The queen sat tall upon her chair, allowing the men to speak their piece, while her eyes watched with sharp attention. Illyra stood beside her mother, her hands folded, her role as quiet support. Soon, Daniel was called into the chamber as well, along with the other soldiers who had been present. He walked with the same measured steps, his face calm, his eyes direct. Illyra felt her chest grow tight, but she turned her gaze toward the maps as if nothing stirred inside her. Still, when he passed into the room, her heart beat with a speed she could not control. The queen allowed the generals to speak first. They argued for hours, some insisting on aggressive action, others warning for caution. None found agreement. At last, the queen lifted her hand, silencing the room. Then her eyes turned toward Daniel. She asked him plainly what he thought should be done. The chamber fell silent. Daniel stood straight, his hands behind his back, and spoke with the same steady voice as before. He described what he had seen during his service, how panic spread when leaders hesitated, how villages fell when armies rushed without reason. He laid out a plan, not full of glory but full of sense. Simple steps to protect the people, and by time for stronger support. His words carried the ring of clear truth, and slowly the generals listened. Illyra watched him speak, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She wanted to smile, but she kept her lips calm. She wanted to tell the whole chamber that this soldier spoke more sense than any noble in the room. But she remained still, letting his voice carry its own weight. When he finished, silence hung heavy, and the queen nodded slowly. His plan would be followed. The generals, though not all pleased, bowed to her judgment. Daniel saluted and stepped back into line. Illyra, standing at her mother's side, trembled only slightly, fighting to maintain her pose. The rest of the day moved quickly. Orders were dispatched, riders sent out, the palace shook with activity. Yet in the middle of all this movement, both Daniel and Illyra carried private thoughts. For her, it was the growing realization that she no longer wished to remain distant. For him, it was the quiet truth that he had given something of himself to the princess without meaning to, and he could not take it back. That evening, as the palace settled into uneasy calm, Illyra found him once again in the courtyard. She walked toward him without hesitation this time. He rose to his feet as she approached, his respect as firm as ever. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was filled with the quiet sound of water running in the fountain nearby. Finally, she broke the silence. She told him his words in the council had saved the palace from rash choices. She told him she admired his courage to speak the truth, even when others doubted. Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not back away. Daniel stood silent, not knowing how to answer at first. Then he said softly that he had done only what was right. He added that her eyes, watching him as he spoke, had given him strength. Illyra felt her composure breaking at last. For years she had lived behind a mask of calm and control. In that courtyard, under the fading light of the day, she allowed herself to show something real. She told him that his presence reminded her of what strength truly meant, and she thanked him for it, not as a princess to a soldier, but as one person to another. It did not touch, did not move closer than what was proper, yet the air between them shifted. Both knew that something had grown in those days of tension and silence. Something far stronger than court customs or lines of rank. Later, when Daniel returned to the soldiers' quarters, he sat once again beneath the tall lamp. And when Illyra returned to her room, she opened her window wide and stared into the courtyard below. Neither could sleep easily that night. Both carried the same thought in their hearts, though neither said it aloud. The soldier had given the princess more than truth, and the princess had given him more than respect. Between them grew something that neither power nor distance could simply erase. and though the future called both of them forward in heavy paths, they knew from that day on that their lives would never again be untouched by the other.